Right. Good morning, and welcome so very much to our Permafrost Discovery Gateway webinar here in October 16, 2025. And our webinar is here to connect the community interested in big data and geospatial information, and of course, connecting those big geospatial data to the real world observations on the ground. And today, we are so fortunate. I'm very grateful to have Torre Jorgenson with us presenting, and he is the owner of Alaska Ecosience, which is a small business in Fairbanks, Alaska, dedicated to research on Alaska's changing landscapes. And he's also an affiliate faculty with the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, and he has worked on ecology and geomorphology studies in the Arctic and boreal forest for 40 years, focusing on ecological land classification and terrain mapping, coastal studies, environmental impact assessments, ecological restoration, permafrost dynamics, soil carbon, drivers of landscape change, and climate change impacts. And internationally, he has been involved with the International Permafrost Association, Arctic Coastal Dynamics Program, Circumboreal Vegetation Mapping Program, and the AMAP Climate Expert Group. So he will be presenting here today, and as hopefully have some time for questions at the end. If we're running short on time on question, put your questions in the chat and in your email, and that way Torre can connect with you afterwards here. So I'm gonna share my screen here and hand it over to Torre. Thank you, Torre.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to talk today about the interactions of sea level rise, sea ice loss, storm flooding, erosion, permafrost thaw that are threatening ecosystems, wildlife, and communities on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. I've been fortunate to work with a number of collaborators over many decades, and here we summarize work that's been ongoing since the mid-90s. And I've had the benefit of support from many agencies over the years. And as the title suggests, we got a lot to chew through here, so I will get going. Next. So we hit the next slide there, Anna.
Yep. Did we bump too far now, perhaps?
Yeah, back up one. First, I'd like to express my heartbreak over the tragedy that's ongoing right now out in the southern YK Delta as a result of the ex-typhoon Halong, and it was a 962 millibar low storm, so fairly strong storm. But what made it so devastating is it took a direct hit down there in the southern portion of the YK Delta, kind of the southeast quadrant of the storm, directly hit several villages down there, Kipnuk, Kwagwilingok, and extended as far north as to the north part of the Delta. It created peak gusts of 100 miles per hour at Tuksuk Bay, a storm surge of 12 feet at Kupnik, middle of the night. And currently 3 people are missing, 1 is dead, and over 1,500 people have displaced right now. Kipnuk is under mandatory evacuation, 700 people being evacuated into Bethel, Anchorage, and communities around the state, and 400 out of Kwagwilingok. And I would encourage you to provide some support to them through the Red Cross. And the Red Cross is actively trying to help these people that have been evacuated. Next. So the YK Delta is a pretty amazing place. It's got a lot of resources that are currently at risk from climate change. There's 50 villages in the region. 18 of them are along the coast. There are about 25,000 Yupik and Chupik people in the region. It's the largest concentration of indigenous people in Alaska in the Arctic. It's pretty amazing. You have these big villages, 500 to 1,000 people that can be scattered just next to each other by 10 or 20 kilometers. And it's way different from up in northern Alaska where you have these small villages 100 or 200 miles apart, or even in the interior, it's a high density related to tremendous resources out there. But the coastal ecosystems are limited to the outer delta. The YK Delta encompasses a lot of terrain, but the actual coastal ecosystems are kind of in the gray area of this map. And this area provides critical habitat to numerous waterbirds, and it's critical subsistent resources for these people that have to depend on wild foods because the high expense of importing food into their communities. Next. So I want to just give you a little highlights about some of the interesting, amazing things about the YK Delta. One is its critical habitat of global significance. It's a breeding area for the entire Alaska populations of emperor goose and the Tavern's cackling goose. But it supports about 60% of Pacific brant and 80% of the greater white-fronted goose populations. And you can look at these flyways and you can see that it's important to the flyways of a lot of shore and wading birds, and they use those for stopover during spring and fall migrations. And here's Jim Sedinger and his team. They're monitoring brant. Jim's been working out there since the 1980s, and here's a roundup of black brant and processing them for monitoring population dynamics. Next. The resources are critical to subsistence lifestyle. Here's just a few illustrations of using marine mammals, relying on birds for food, tremendous fisheries out there, and there's a fish rack drying chum salmon. And these are photos by Frank Kime. He was a teacher out there for many years out in Cooper Bay, among other places. Next. And the YK Delta is a rich cultural heritage and traditions that have been preserved over centuries and millennia. And there's still a large portion of the population are Yupik and Chupik speakers, so keeping their cultural traditions alive. And I mentioned the work of Anne Fiona Riordan, who's an anthropologist who's done tremendous work documenting the cultural and traditional oral heritage out there on the Delta, and she's produced several books documenting traditional knowledge. Next. And here's view of Hooper Bay, one of 18 villages along the coast. Most of these are built on permafrost. Down in the lower left, you see one of the permafrost plateaus, and most of the infrastructure is up on pilings because it's built on permafrost. Next. So now I get to some ecosystem geography. To understand the impacts, you kind of have to understand the geography of ecosystems. And here's a kind of a topo sequence across the central portion of the outer delta, and I've divided it up into 4 terraces, kind of the tidal flats, active deposits, terrace 1, and then terrace 2 and terrace 3 kind of have inactive deposits with occasional flooding and very little sedimentation. And then over on terrace 4 is the permafrost jacked up related habitats. Back in '94, we didn't have good spatial data of the topography of the area, and I spent 3 days making a level survey along that yellow line, kind of 7 kilometers. And after 3 days of doing that, I came back to camp and told them I discovered it was flat. And I got laughed out of camp. Anybody could see that it was flat, but we didn't really know how flat. And here's the elevation profile with distance, and that surface varies by about 30 centimeters over 7 kilometers. So extremely flat, and that's part of the problem with coastal flooding is those topography of the delta. Next. But here's a more modern era snapshot of the topography developed by LiDAR. It's the same topo sequence, and I've got a series of monitoring transects that are all tied in. And here you can see these orange reddish areas that are old beach ridges, and then you have the basins behind them, and then in white are the permafrost plateaus. And here you can see a little bit longer transect developed off the DEM that still has the flat topography extending out to 11 kilometers, still varying by about 30 centimeters over 10 kilometers, with the exception of the tidal guts and then the permafrost plateaus. Next. So let's look at some of these geomorphic environments. Here's the active delta floodplain. You can see the dendritic pattern of these tidal gut channels with water moving in and out on a daily basis. And here's an example of a soil profile showing nearly continuous sedimentation over time. Next. And here's a couple of common ecotypes related to that active delta floodplain. Here's a saline wet Hopner sedge meadow dominated by Carex subspecies, and it's a critical foraging habitat for black brant and other geese. And you can see all the goose poop scattered among the orangish Carex subspecies. So it's a critical foraging habitat for young broods. And then here's a slightly higher Romenskii meadows, Carex Romenskii sedge that's very productive, and you can see the lush green color from the high productivity of it. Next. So then if we move slightly inland and slightly up, we have what I call the inactive delta floodplain, and it's characterized by less sedimentation, less flooding, less sedimentation, less salinity. So it's slightly brackish conductivities around 2,000 to 5,000 millisiemens per centimeter, microsiemens per centimeter. And you can see that there's some stabilization going on up at the surface with less frequent flooding and more organic accumulation. And then you can see some of these remaining old abandoned tidal guts going through the landscape on the left, and these impounded water bodies that are left kind of behind by the vegetated surface that's chugging up, depositing organics around these ponds. Next. And a couple of common ecotypes on this geomorphic unit is the slightly brackish wet meadows dominated by Carex rariflora, and Petrum nigrum is a common shrub that occurs there. And then many of these little ponds get filled in, colonized by mare's tail Hipparus tetraphylla, and makes for a very beautiful interspersion of community types. Next. And then finally, we get up to the abandoned delta floodplain. I call it abandoned because it's rarely flooded and rarely has any sedimentation. On the left, you can see these permafrost plateaus that have been jacked up by permafrost formation. They're typically about a meter, sometimes meter and a half higher than the surrounding salt marshes. And here's a picture of the soil profile showing pretty thick sphagnum peat at the top. The darkish, blackish area is the Empetrum, Carex rariflora, Empetrum peat related to the inactive floodplain. And then below that, you have mostly silt sediments indicative of the active floodplain. So you see the whole sequence, and in a few places, right under that Empetrum, black Empetrum peat, I've found this willow, Salix ovalifolia. It's a halophytic willow, and it's just spread out flat with the leaves in place like the sphagnum blanket dropped on it overnight. And I've dated that to when I've radiocarbon dated, it's come out modern, indicative that the permafrost, probably that transition indicative of permafrost formation primarily happened during the Little Ice Age, or the end of the Little Ice Age 150 years ago. Next. So here are a couple of these freshwater or non-saline vegetation types. The moist birch ericaceous shrub, it accumulates a lot of lichens and sphagnum and dwarf birch. It's a very good habitat for berry production in terms of Rubus camemoris, cloudberry, and crowberry. And then surrounding these permafrost plateaus on the right, you have these quite productive wet sedge meadows and bog meadows. And here you can see the interspersion of these wet sedge meadows along lake shores, and then the darker brown permafrost plateaus that are popping up above it. And here you can also see that these permafrost plateaus are often ringed by driftwood from previous storm surges. Next. So I've done quite a bit of work on permafrost sampling, both coring with the cypre core and then exposures along the riverbanks. And so we have good data to kind of understand the stratigraphy and ground ice contents of these permafrost plateaus. And generally they are not too ice rich. On the right, you see a little bit more ice patterns or thicker ice patterns related to upward freezing or quasi-genetic permafrost. And then down on the right is much lower ice contents at below kind of 1.5 meters, representative epigenetic downward freezing in these permafrost plateaus. I don't really have a good idea of the thickness of the permafrost, but based on the amount of jacking and ice contents, I'm presuming they're probably about 10 meters thick in terms of permafrost. And it could be maybe 20 meters, but not too thick. Next. So then kind of lastly, in terms of ecosystem geography, is differentiating the coastal tidally affected habitats from the inland habitats. And here's a map of ecological landscapes. What I mostly want to show are these pink and purple areas. The pink is kind of mostly active floodplains, the dark purple inactive, and then the kind of the darker green are also kind of coastal plain dominated by these permafrost plateaus, but still have tidal guts running up through them and will be susceptible to flooding in the future. And then up on the north and kind of the bright purple colors, that's the modern delta from the Yukon River. And then inland are a bunch of other terrains that are kind of geographically part of the delta, but they're non-coastal landscapes. Next. So kind of here's my approach to assessing the change on the YK delta. It involves a conceptual modeling of just trying to identify key processes that need to be monitored to explain change. Using field monitoring with a network of many plots across 3 study areas, addressing some of these process components identified by conceptual modeling, kind of an ecological classification to partition the variability of ecological processes and components across the landscape. And then paleoecological studies in the soil profiles to understand past change, and then some remote sensing of time series of high resolution imagery to also understand short-term past changes. Next. So in the process model, kind of look at the larger regional effects that go down to kind of landscape level effects, and then we get down to the actual physiological components that affect growth and productivity, and then how those affect habitat abundance, composition, and productivity. And then through Jim's work with his brand dynamics, looking at the effects of goose habitats and also shorebird habitat use. So here's some photos of us in action. There's Dana Brown surveying away. There's a photo of salt-killed effects during salinity monitoring. And I've tried to keep a tide gauge going. You kind of see me trying to put in an instrument out in the tidal flats and get it below low water, and it's fairly hazardous. I've abandoned this site. It's too much risk getting stuck in the mud and not getting out. And then looking at the sedimentation profiles. And then here's my wife Janet doing some point sampling in our permanent permanent plots. Next. So these processes get distributed unequally across the landscape, and so kind of the ecological classification has helped to partition how these processes might be different in different locations. And it's pretty complicated diagram of transitions between ecotypes, but it's generally organized by geomorphic unit. You can see it on the left with ecotypes associated with tidal flats, active floodplains, inactive floodplains, and then the abandoned ones. And if you looked at a trajectory through the soil profiles and across the landscape, you can see that tidal rivers contribute sedimentation to the tidal flats that converts it to a saline channel barrens, and with more sedimentation, it gets converted to a saline wet Hopner sedge meadow, and then eventually to a brackish wet sedge Romenskii sedge meadow. And then with organic accumulation and kind of desalinization farther inland, it gets converted to a slightly brackish wet rare flora meadow. With more organics, it can get, and raising of the surface, it can be converted to a slightly brackish moist crowberry dwarf scrub, and with that organics changes the energy balance, and permafrost can form and jack it up to a lowland moist birch ericaceous shrub. But then if you have thermokarst and erosion, you can go right back down to a saline tidal meadow. And so there are many pathways and interactions between these ecosystem types. Next. So here's our monitoring network. It's we're in 3 study areas. The main one is Tatukok River. That's where the main Jim's main bird camp is. And then the Kashunik, the K series have 3 transects up there. And then over in the Mennokanuk, I have 2 transects over there. So kind of replicated the network within 3 study areas. And within each study area, I have a gradient-oriented transect illustrated down there at the bottom. And then totally we have 495 sites with some kind of measurement. And these have been done kind of at sporadic intervals from 1994 to 2023. And these 3 areas, they're basically about 20 to 25 kilometers apart. And these 3 networks we've tied together with a geodetic control network. So every measurement is got X, Y, Z coordinates to it, just about at the centimeter level precision. And we can tie in our, say, sedimentation and salinization measurements across these 3 areas at centimeter level accuracy. Next. And here's a little bit about operating on the Delta. You have to operate in boats across these areas. On a good day, when at high tide, you can pull up right to the edge of the bank, tidal gut, and unload. If you get delayed out there doing field work too late, you might get down back to the boat with the tidal gut emptied out with no water, and spend the evening out there waiting for the water to come back in so you can get out. Sometimes going down big rivers without having a good GPS track of the bathymetry, you can end up running on a mid-channel bar. And if you do hit a bar like that when the tide's gone and out, you got about 10 minutes to unload your boat, get it off the bar, and get back into a deeper channel and reload. Next. So let's get to the interacting factors here. Kind of the big driver of concern is sea level rise. There aren't very many stations, long-term stations, to assess that, but our best one is at Nome to the north of about 200 kilometers. And there's been monitoring there from 1992 to 24, and the average rate of sea level rise there now is estimated to be 4.2 millimeters per year. And that'll be an important number when we start getting back to sedimentation rates. And then the relative sea level rise projected by NOAA for this location is an increase of 0.2 meters by 2050 and 0.7 meters by 2100. And we'll go back to talking about how flat the delta is and what sea level rise of 0.7 meters could mean for this flat landscape. Next. So then another big driver is the sea ice loss in the Bering Sea. On the left are kind of median monthly sea ice extents. You can see the YK delta in yellow. And you can see in November, ice is starting to form along the shoreline 5 to 10, 20 kilometers out. But it doesn't really get fully protected until December. And then we reach maximum extents in March. And the sea ice, it's important because it affects the storm fetch, the fetch from storms. And the loss of sea ice could be really important for a longer storm season, which could lead to increased erosion, flooding, salinization. And then there's also feedbacks to ocean acidification. On the right, we see the changes in sea ice extent over time for different months, and you'll see up at the top the decrease in sea ice during March. And most notable is the record low sea ice extent in 2018 was nearly an ice-free Bering Sea. It was quite freakish. And the projections for sea ice here are predicted. The ice-free season is projected to increase from 5.5 months to 8.5 months by 2100. So it would result in a 2-month delay in freezing. So no ice protection during November and December still during important storm seasons, and a 1-month advance in melt, and that can be really critical to nesting during the nesting period early in summer. Next. So Dave Atkinson has done work, he and his colleagues and students mapping the storm tracks and frequency. Over on the left, you see the cumulative history of storm tracks broken in by season. And what's probably most notable is the increase of storm tracks during the September, October, November period. Most of them go towards the Gulf of Alaska, but there's a slight increase in the trajectories northwards during the latter part of the year. And then in recent works, David has also summarized the kind of cumulative storm energy across these tracks. And what's particularly notable here is the concentration of storm energies during the fall, September, October, November, in the southern portion of the Yukon Delta. You can see a 50 for index of storm energy. Of course, the greatest concentrations northern the Gulf of Alaska, but there's an increase in the Bering Sea during the fall period. And that where that 50 is just about where that ex-typhoon Kipnik or Halong hit Kipnik and Kwangrillinok. Next. Oh, thanks for the arrow, Anna. I wish I had the arrow myself, but can't control it. We can compare that to ex-typhoon Merbok, 17th of September 2022. This is our recent mega storm, and it was a 948 millibar low, and you can see how huge and extensive this storm was across the region. And once again, that southeast quadrant of the storm took a direct hit on the YK Delta. This caused flooding and damage along 1,500 kilometers of coastline. It raised water levels at Nome to a peak of 2.91 meters, and it affected 37 villages, including 14 villages on the YK Delta. Next. It's hard to obtain a record of the geographic distribution of flooding across the Delta, and here are a few incidences of being able to record flooding from remote sensing. One was radar sat image collected in 2005 with the 2005 storm, and you can compare that relative to unflooded conditions on the upper left. And here we see just manually interpreting this fuzzy gray area, indicating storms extending 35 kilometers inland. It's an incredible distance for flood inundation. And then we have a little smaller storm in 2006. And then in 2011, a large storm, we can somewhat interpret the flooding extent from in 2011 from MODIS imagery that compares the snow-covered areas in white with the gray areas affected by flooding over the snow cover. So we have some indication of flooding extent there. And here we see the interactions can be more frequent severe storms occurring late summer and fall. That interacts with the loss of sea ice cover, leading to extended storm flooding during the winter. And then the sea level rise will raise the water surface base for flooding. Next. So trying to understand past flooding and magnitudes, we've surveyed drift line elevations across these monitoring areas, and here are some debris lines which have been interpreted to be the previous largest storm, 1978. Started these measurements in 1994, so presumably our best interpretation is that was related to a 78 storm. And then when we went back out in 2023, we found large driftwood pieces scattered entirely across these permafrost plateaus, and it would take about a meter of water to push these driftwood logs and bases across that thing. So I think that the 2023 flood was a meter higher than our previous larger documented flood. And then we have evidence of buried driftwood logs in these plateaus indicative of earlier storms. Next. So there are some sparse data for water level monitoring across the region. Primarily Nome is our longest station, and even that doesn't go back very far. It goes to 92. Inuit goes back to 2016. And then I've maintained some sporadic monitoring over to Tukok 2007 to 12, and then 15 to 17. It's a very difficult place to maintain instrumentation, primarily by ice scouring during winter. But we can see that the water levels are loosely correlated. We had this large storm, 92, 2005, 2011. And then the largest one at Murbach had elevations of 3.5 meters at Inuit. I estimate the flood elevation at Tukok at 3.9 meters. And we have these daily, and my observations from the tide gauge at Tukok have a peak at 2011, 15, and 16 that correspond fairly well with water surface elevations at Nome. And at the very bottom, I have an estimate for the overbank water level when the water goes overbank and floods at 1.9 meters. Next. So here's a kind of a schematic diagram. I've compressed the 7-kilometer transect into a few inches here with great vertical exaggeration. But what I want to use this diagram for is showing how the changes in sea level rise could affect tidal flooding. And currently our bottom blue line there for mean high water is at 1.18 meters above mean sea level using my local datum developed from my tide gauge. And then we have a monthly maximum high water of 1.87 meters. So those are current conditions. But if you add on 24 centimeters of elevation with sea level rise, you get a monthly maximum of 2.05 meters by 2050. And that's enough to start flooding the inland basins on a monthly basis. And then if you add 70 centimeters, you get up to a monthly maximum higher water of 2.5 centimeters, 2.57, and that gets to almost flooding the permafrost plateaus on a monthly basis. And then up at the top, I have the estimated water level for the 2011 storm at 2.87 meters. That reached the rims of the permafrost plateaus, but didn't exceed the surface. And then at the very top is my estimate for Typhoon Merbach of 3.9 meters at the coast. And you'll notice that there's a water slope that goes inland, so you don't have a same water surface elevation across the whole delta, but there's a slope to this water surface. Next. So with flooding, you bring in saline coastal waters, and we've been monitoring salinity across this network, and you can see the salinity varies almost 5-fold across years in response to these flooding events. And what's notable is the large peak in 2007. That's 2 years after the 2005 flood. And interestingly, not too big a response to the 2011 flood, but then again, another large response to the 2015 flood. And I've done this monitor. These numbers are means for the number of stations situated in slightly brackish, wet, rareifloara sedge meadows, and then the birch ericaceous low scrub. So we see strong response of salinity to the flooding. And here's a photo on the right of a self-killed area on these slightly brackish, rareifloara sedge meadows. So this is a model for how these this ecotype will change with increasing salinity. Next. But along with flooding, you bring in sediments, and there'll be an interesting balance between the surface accretion or accumulation of sediments that lifts up the surface in conjunction at a time with sea level rise. And then back in 1994 and 95, I painted these little patches of spray paint on the tundra surface, and have been going back to monitoring the depths to these paint patches. So kind of over on the core in the middle, I have a red paint and a blue paint, and a blue paint down there in 95, 96, 98. And then repainted in 2007, and then repainted in 2015. And here you can see kind of intervals of large sediment accumulation related to the 2005 storm, 2011 storm, and the sedimentation with 2022. And here's the thickness that's been accumulated, kind of the mean thickness in millimeters. And we can see by 2023 in the moist willow gorse scrub community, those kind of the levee communities, we've accumulated about almost 16 centimeters of sediment. And you compare that to kind of the more inland, higher, slightly brackish, rareifloara sedge meadows, and that's only accumulated about 40 millimeters or 40 centimeters. So you can see the communities on the outer delta are still chugging up with plenty of sediment, keeping up with sea level rise. But I'm afraid the communities farther inland that don't receive the sediment are going to be left behind. Next. And we've also used cesium-137 as a marker, looking at bomb spikes. And here on the active floodplain, you see one of my paint patches, and then the paint evident down in the cores. And we can extend that sedimentation record back to 1964. And here we have 26 centimeters of accumulation since 64 at a average rate of 5.5 millimeters per year. Remember that I said the sea level rise was occurring at 4.2 millimeters per year. So here we have a outer portion of the delta with some community types that can keep up with sea level rise. And then you compare that with the slightly brackish meadows inland that's only accumulated 6 centimeters since 64 for an average of 1.3 millimeters and unable to keep up with sea level rise. Next. And we can also use deeper stratigraphy to look at changes in communities over time, and also some radiocarbon dating to help us look at rates of accumulation over time. I'd like to note here over on the far left, exposure 1 that has radiocarbon dates going back to 6800 and 7160, so quite an old landscape. When you compare kind of the basal accumulation of peats in the middle inactive floodplain, and our dates can go back to as little as 280 or 845 years, so indicative of a period of stabilization and accumulation of peats. A lot to interpret out of this diagram, but we'll move on to the next. So here's an interesting profile, at least in my perspective, and my paleoecological interpretation of it is the first thing, look at these dates, 6800 and 7160. What's interesting about that is those are too old to be deltaic sediments. At that time, sea level was 4 to 5 meters lower, so my interpretation is that these are actually Aeolian remnants of the Bering land bridge. And one of the reasons why this delta is so flat is it's kind of a wave cut bench that extends across this old Bering land bridge deposit. And it's quite unique. Modern deltas ought to have a slope that's such as the modern delta up at kind of Emonic. It goes from about a 3 or 4 meter bank 30 kilometers to the coast with a direct slope down to the coast, whereas this portion of the landscape's completely flat and has a different geomorphic origin to it. And but the true deltaic sediments are mostly developed around 3,500 years ago, based on the coring inland, and it coincides with the same time the Yupik people arrived at around 3,500 years ago. So they arrived when the sea level came up sufficiently to start depositing deltaic sediments across this region. And what's also noticeable is there's very little compaction and settlement due to age. And this is really important because places like the Mississippi Delta are sinking from compaction of sediments, whereas we don't have that process, or it's negligible in the YK Delta. Next. And another consequences of heavy sedimentation is the drowning or smothering of vegetation. And here's a change from 94 to 2011, showing the elimination of the saline wet Hopner sedge meadows from heavy deposition. And on the left, you'll see there's a lot of goose poop around that Carrick subspeciae, a critical habitat for brood rearing black brant, and that was lost primarily from this 2005 heavy sedimentation event. So a big loss of critical habitat from heavy sedimentation. Next. I've used point sampling of high resolution imagery in randomly distributed grids across this portion of the delta, and find that most of the changes have been due to primarily to channel erosion, deposition, heavy deposition that's forming new terrain. And then the other big change has been from permafrost degradation. And it's different across different portions of the landscape, with most of the permafrost degradation occurring inland where the permafrost plateaus are. Next. And here's some neat work by Matt McCander using time series of Landsat imagery going back to 1972, showing the distribution of both erosion along channels and along the outer coast. And what's really noticeable is the large amount of erosion along these big tidal rivers. And these tidal rivers are really unique in terms of they don't develop from precipitation input in the inlands running a river to the coast. These are primarily just big tidal guts that flush daily and change elevation by almost a meter and a half to two meters twice a day. So huge influx of water in and out of these tidal guts, rivers leading to high rates of erosion. And up in the upper right is a situation for the town of Newtok that's in the outer bend of one of these big tidal rivers, showing the huge impacts of bank erosion. Next. And then finally we get to permafrost degradation, and kind of there's two main processes here. One is the lateral degradation from saltwater flooding, and you see these little black lines or moats forming along the margins of these plateaus. I call them thermokarst moats. Quite extensive development after the 2005 storm. And then the other process is the formation of thermokarst pits. Below is a newly developed pit since 1996. And this is leading to rapid fragmentation of the plateaus with strong feedbacks with water surface accumulation in these pits. So it's a process that's really not amenable to thermal modeling, but it's critical to how these things degrade. Next. And we have some temperature monitoring indicative of kind of permafrost health. And earlier on the left, you see that the blue line, which is the temperature near the top of the permafrost, indicates strong cooling during the winter and no thawing during the summer. And then by 2014 and 15, we see that the thawing is extended down into the permafrost table below the measurement. But here we still have strong winter cooling, which is at least a little bit helpful for maintaining the stability of permafrost, but eventually we'll lose that winter cooling and stability. Next. And here's some modeling by Sergei Marshenko looking at what potential of projected mean annual soil temperatures at a 2-meter depth. And you can see in 2021, we still have a fair amount of green patches across the delta, some yellow, indicative of permafrost right at the transition. And then by 2050, projected temperatures are already up at 1 to 2 degrees centigrade above zero. And then by 2100, temperatures are already starting to reach 2 to 4 degrees C. So my general projections is we'll lose most of our permafrost and permafrost plateaus within the next 3 decades. Next. So a few more slides. One is with these changes of flooding regimes, bringing the water higher and the permafrost lowering the surface, we'll have both habitats lost and habitats that can maintain equilibrium. And this will have big consequences to a range of birds and their habitats. Freshwater ponds are important to sabine gulls, tundra swans, eider brood rearing. Those will be lost by the salinization. The slightly brackish meadows, they're important to cackler geese, sandhill cranes, redneck phalaropes. Those are also a highly endangered ecotype. And then the permafrost plateaus, have strong berry production, and they're used by for some species such as bark-tailed godwits, nesting for ruddy and black turnstones, rock sandpiper, blackberry plovers, western sandpipers. Those permafrost plateaus, they'll be gone in the next several decades. But then there's our habitats that'll do fine, the salt marshes on the outer coast that have high sedimentation rates, and these really productive habitats are used by brants, dunlins, western sandpipers. But also notable, by 2100, we'll have daily flooding. Will eliminate extensive nesting areas that these areas will be covered by flooding on a biweekly, daily to biweekly basis. Next. And then we get to societal impacts. Here's the example of Newtok that's in the process of being abandoned and moved, being relocated. And there's a lot of work going on by state and federal agencies to do the detailed geomorphic, environmental, and geotechnical analyses of these villages. So that's not been my primary interest of work, but there's a lot of ongoing work on these villages. And here we see the high erosion rates at Newtok projected to 2027, and the effects of storm flooding from 2005. But these are really expensive costs to relocate a village. 27 million's already been spent at Newtok for their move, and estimates are 100 to 300 million to complete a move. And so these will require large federal, state, and village efforts to abandon and move these villages. Next. And here's examples of flooding from ex-typhoon Merbok in 2022. It's extensive all the way up and down the coast. Hooper Bay, Napakiak, Newtok, and Kotlik all had severe flooding. Next. And here's a photo from just a few days ago, 12th of October, 25, for Kipnuk. Kipnuk is primarily built on permafrost plateaus. Here I show a little white arrow showing the thermokarst moat developing along these permafrost plateaus. And then the brighter green areas are new vegetation that colonizes in the recently depressed sinking terrain. So it was a really bad place to build. And now it's suffering consequences of the sea level rise and permafrost degradation. Kipnuk was supposed to receive a $20 million grant from EPA for riverbank protection, but it was recently canceled by the current administration. And then most of this infrastructure is built on permafrost plateaus, and so is highly endangered. Next. So kind of summarize what these interacting impacts can be across the broad landscape. Here's a map of bird distributions in the central portion of the delta, and then villages. And these landscapes are vulnerable to various levels of interaction, from sea level rise, storm surge, flooding, erosion, salinization, and thermokarst. If we look at the bird distributions, broken it up into these kind of broad groups, a narrow coastal group, that's these birds that are in the darker orange, that are more dependent on the highly productive coastal habitats along the margin that we're projecting will keep up fairly well with sea level rise from high sedimentation rates. And then we have these broad coastal groups inland, and these will be highly affected by salinization and loss of permafrost plateaus inland. And then on the right, we've identified 10 villages that are at the highest risk. They're in red, and then intermediate risk in moderate. And I've adapted kind of a geohazard rating system from the Denali Commission that kind of averages the risks of flooding, erosion, and permafrost thaw. And down on the lower right, I have Kipnuk and Gwilingok, and I can see my map is already out of date. I have a moderate risk, and that really it's at a high risk. But you'll see the light pink areas are susceptible to flooding, sedimentation, but will mostly stay in sea level equilibrium. And then the darker purple is susceptible to salinization and flooding. And then the kind of the intermediate pink is susceptible to thermokarst, salinization, and flooding. So you can see a huge portion of the delta is going to be transformed over the next century, and even quicker by 2025 by losing these permafrost plateaus. So an area it's maybe half the size of Louisiana is going to be transformed. And then there's things that are happening inland. The yellow area is susceptible to thermokarst, wetland expansion, and fires. And then in the blue, hard to see them, but those are the erosion hotspots mapped by Matt McAnder. So I think that's it. One last slide, questions. And sometimes I'll peg out the fun meter out there, but it can be, when you run aground in the middle of a mid-channel bar, it drops down to low. Okay, thanks for listening.
Thank you so very much, Torre. Greatly appreciate it. Oh, wow. Thank you so very much. I'm gonna go.